I think everyone knows our guest today, but I want to introduce him anyway. Pablo is president and CEO of ERCOT, the organization responsible for managing the flow of electricity to more than 27 million Texans. Pablo took on this role in 2022 at a pivotal moment for the Texas grid. He brings decades of leadership experience across the energy sector, including senior roles at NiSource and American Electric Power. Today, he's helping guide the grid through rapid demand growth, new technologies, and a changing energy mix. So Pablo, just thank you so much for your time. We know that you're very busy. I just appreciate you making the time for us.
Absolutely. I think having conversations like the ones we're going to have today are important because things are changing so quickly. And it's important to help bring everybody along with us because this is a community function that we all are part of. Electricity is all part of every one of our lives and in every way from personal to business and everything in between. So it's critical that we have these conversations during these dynamic times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you stepped into the role of ERCOT CEO during a pretty, tremendous change and attention to what was going on. Like in Winter Storm Uri had just happened. Like there was a lot of changing, a lot of things. And I'll be honest, like when you first came, like I kind of was wondering if they were bringing in kind of like a hatchet guy, like it was like going to be a temporary thing. Like if I'm completely honest, but you've done a great job and stuck around. So I was like, that's pretty neat.
That's really great. I'm thankful for that too.
But what has surprised you the most in the first 3 years leading ERCOT?
I guess what's been a really interesting learning is, and when you work in the utility space, and I worked in the utility space in ERCOT back when I was with AEB Texas, but I worked in the utility space at USTEP for quite a while, for over about 20 years. And I was surprised how different grid operations is from what it looks like inside of the utility. So the issues that the grid operator deals with, in contrast to what a utility company deals with, is pretty stark. And while there's a lot of kind of overlap on elements of it, of course, but kind of the focus of what we're looking at, which is, looking at all of the issues across all the different components and players in the system, it's a lot more complex trying to consider all of the needs of the different stakeholders that are part of the process. When you're a utility company, you're always laser focused on your customers, directly, and you're serving them and you're making sure that you are working constructively with, your regulators and policymakers to serve your customers. At the grid operator level, the customers are still a very critical part of the conversation, but you're doing that through one layer removed in helping to oversee the processes that govern the utilities and the power producers and the retail electric providers and the brokers and traders, the large industrials and the small consumer, everything in between. And so you're really thinking about kind of the policy making that affects each one of those segments in a different way. And that's what surprised me a little bit in terms of just how complex that can be. How in many cases, how political it can be. We have a very unique environment in Texas where, we govern, legislate all the policy for what happens in the wholesale power markets, which is different than what happens in other states. And that's something that, adds to the complexity inside of Texas, but it also gives us benefits, gives us the agility, the ability to make change. And we're seeing that realized today at the pace of change that's happening.
And I think you came in at such an interesting time after Winter Storm Uri. Like we just have the 5-year anniversary of Uri recently. Do you still feel like that's hanging over our heads, or do you feel like we're now entering this new chapter? We're going to talk about load growth and data centers and all that, but you came into the job during that kind of tumultuous period. Do you feel like that's behind us now, or do you still feel kind of the shadow of Winter Storm Uri hanging over us?
I firmly believe that the memory of Uri is going to remain with those who experienced it for years and years to come. I don't think it's something that is going to be forgotten and put into the past, and nor should it, because it has taught us lessons across so many different facets of the work that we do, the importance of great communications. That's something that was, I think, a very early lesson learned in the process, that there needs to be so much better transparency in terms of the role that ERCOT plays, what we do and how we do it, why we do it, who we work with in delivering the general service that everybody experiences. It was clear that it was not well understood as we went through the whole Uri experience, and we're still working on that facet of it. But beyond that, the lessons learned in terms of just how critically important and dependent we all are on electric reliability is something that we can't ever forget or should put in our past. And that's something that should remain at the forefront as we think about policies, as we think about protocol changes, as we think about, how we're going to manage the growth that's ahead of us, how we're going to manage the transition to the different supply resources and everything, in between. So it's something that I want to continuously be helping people understand the things that we're doing to change the circumstances that allowed Uri to happen. And we have made a lot of progress on those fronts, but it's never going to be gone from the memories of those who experienced it. And we're always going to keep the lessons learned in our forefront because those lessons have to endure.
Yeah, so since Uri, there's been quite an addition of capacity. It's been a bit of a different type of resource mix that we have. I think during Winter Storm Uri, there was just a couple hundred megawatts of solar. Now there's tens of gigawatts of solar and like an energy storage. And can you speak to like how the system has kind of changed since then, Yvette?
Yeah, it's changed quite a bit. Over 60 gigawatts of new supply added to the ERCOT grid since Winter Storm Uri. That's a huge number. Yeah. Last year, we helped connect a record amount of generation supply into the ERCOT grid, over 16 gigawatts in 1 year. And we're on track to have a record first quarter, this quarter, in terms of interconnecting the supply. So it has been changing rapidly. As you pointed out, the majority of the supply coming online is solar resources and energy storage resources. Kind of makes up the large bulk of the supply that's connected in since Uri. And what that's doing is it's helping grid reliability through several lenses. So, the battery storage has such a unique, flexible characteristic where it is able to be responsive instantaneously when it's needed, or on both being able to discharge as a supply source or for charge in terms of balancing for a load need. And it can do that instantly at any point in time. And you're right, back during Uri, we had in the low hundreds of megawatts of energy storage. And today we had over 16 gigawatts installed, well over that in terms of gigawatt hours, because most of our storage is between an hour and a half and 2 hours now. So that's a fundamental change in what batteries can do. If you remember, during the summer periods of 2022 and 2023, those are some fairly hot summers. 23 was, I think, the second hottest summer in Texas history. And that's when we reached our peak. We hit the peak of 85, a little over 85 gigawatts that summer. And we were experiencing conservation calls. We were pretty concerned about the levels of consumption in contrast to the supply we had. A short 2 years later, with the additions of the solar and battery storage that we've seen in the last 2 years, we've had similar levels of demand and have not seen any kind of scarcity issues related to that. And so it's completely changed the tenor and the risk profile of summers in ERCOT. That's been a tremendous benefit. The batteries also have been tremendous help during the winter in terms of managing the transitions of the early morning hours and in the solar sunsets and muting as well. And so it's really helping with those periods that are now emerging as those peaks. It has changed the reliability picture. And if you look at where the grid is from a probabilistic perspective today, we are more reliable in terms of the risk of emergencies today than we were 5 years ago or 3 years ago. Now, all of that is dependent upon how much load we have today and what the mix is. So when you look into the future, that can change. And so we can't sit back today and say we're good because all these additions have made us more reliable. It's really our job to look ahead 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years and go, is the trajectory going to continue to remain improving, or is it going to change? Is it going to become less reliable? And those are the things that we are focused on right now because the growth story ahead of us is significant. And sitting back and just kind of looking at what's happened over the last 5 years and thinking that in service for the next 5, I don't think works.
I think you teed that up perfectly. We want to ask you about load forecasts. We want to ask you about data centers, load growth. And I think you hit the nail on the head. There's 49 other states that love to have the grid we have in Texas right now, as far as the diversity of our resource mix, the reliability. When you look at costs as well, we have some of the lowest costs in the country when you look at kilowatt hour. But when we think about 5-10 years from now, the load forecast that we're seeing, I guess the first question is, how do you look at that load forecast? Do you take any of it with a grain of salt? How do you figure out what's real and what's not real? And then when you have that number, how do you plan a grid of the future, given all of the, not just data centers, right? The population explosion, industrial loads that are coming to Texas. How do you plan for all that?
Yeah, and if you look at the population, just in the last 5 years, we've seen population grow from 25, 26 million in the state to over 31 million. Tremendous growth. The economic growth from a GDP perspective has far exceeded the U.S. economic growth for the same period of time. So it's across all the measures. It's people, it's the core economy, and it's the new economies, the digital economy that are coming, are driving some of the fastest growth measures anywhere in the world right here in Texas. So as we look at that, the forecast that we received last year, if you all recall, we got a load forecast that was 230 gigawatts for about the 2030 time period. And, today we peaked up, we have around an 85 gigawatt peak. So it's almost tripling the size of the ERCOT grid if we believe that that's going to be the trajectory. I do take that with a grain of salt. We recognize that, with these interconnection processes we have today, that really it's very simple to start a process to think about connecting a large load into the grid. It literally takes a computer and a relatively straightforward submission, and you can be in our large load queue. Of all of that load that's out there, about 200 and plus gigawatts of load that's there today, the vast majority of it, over half of it, hasn't begun any process at all with formally interconnecting into the grid, other than just submitting an application. So half of it you take off right away. Then you've got like another, 70 gigawatts that's out there that has some start process started, but has not advanced far enough to have what's considered planning studies ready to go. So you're very quickly down to a level that's, I think, a lot more reasonable, where those projects that are serious, that have backing behind it, are moving forward. And that's what we're really trying to focus on today. There's policy discussions going on around how to define the requirements to be inclusive in this forecast in ERCOT. There's rulemaking going on, more than policy, rulemaking. And that's going to be a really important outcome that I think everybody who's interested in the space has to watch closely, because the requirements around that are going to drive everything else. It's going to be inclusion requirements for being studied in this new batch process that we're talking about. Sure, we'll talk a little bit about that. It's going to drive the inclusion in the planning forecast, which is used for transmission planning. And that's a super critical element. If you think about that, we need to get that number right, because transmission investments are extremely long dated. They last 30, 40, 50 years. They are very expensive. They can cost billions of dollars. And so you have to be building a system that is going to be rationalized and reasonable for the load and the consumers that are out there. And that's an important part of that forecast. But I also just want to add, this forecast is also used to schedule and plan outages on a system for generators. We use the load forecast to create the space for generators to take outages in the future. And they need that in order to maintain their plants. We use the load forecast to set our budget at ERCOT, what everybody pays for ERCOT to do its job. So it's such a critical part of all of these facets of what we do. And so getting that right is critical. And this rulemaking that's happening right now around it is going to be very consequential.
Yeah, I was talking to one transmission service provider, and they said a few years ago, like 3 years ago, they had one large load study in their system. And, last month they had 100 concurrent large load studies going on. And this is one of there's really only four big ones in the state, but this is one of the big ones. And these loads, to my understanding, are quite different, right? It's different than having diffuse load, like just population growing and overall, because these loads are also points, like they exist in a particular location in a particular place, and that has particular implications for all the infrastructure and how to get power in and out to them. And then plus, like when you do like a large load study on one, it can impact what the large load study would look like for another one across the system, because like we can't scale the infrastructure infinitely. So can you just talk a little bit about what this batch process is that ERCOT's like, that you're having rulemakings and proceedings and like meetings and all this kind of stuff? Like what will that do that'll be different than how it's done before?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit and talk about kind of how we used to manage some of the grid stability issues prior to this whole scenario evolving. So we would have what's called our largest single contingency defined for the system, where we plan for the eventuality of a very significant loss of supply in this case. And it would be around one of the nuclear units that operate in the state of Texas. We have large nuclear facilities that are over a gigawatt in size at a unit level. And what you need to be able to do is there's the possibility that if something goes wrong in the system, you could see a nuclear unit drop offline. And so you have to be able to have the reserves to be able to manage the stability of the grid in the eventuality that something like that happens. And so that was always a way we talked about you would manage the eventuality and risk associated with very large changes in a supplier. Well, then now comes to the data centers. And data centers, like you said, are concentrated loads in a location. Today, a large data center might be 60, 80, or 100 megawatts, a very large data center under current definitions. In the future, what we're looking at is sites that are going to have 1 gig to potentially 2, 3, or 4 gigs in kind of a concentrated area. And so that takes that whole paradigm of planning for stability and single contingency issues to a whole different degree. Because now it's not just a potential supply unit coming offline, you now have loads that have the same risk where they could trip offline and they're larger than your otherwise the previously defined single contingency. So now we have to start thinking about planning the grid differently with reserves in order to be able to manage that eventuality. So that just to add that dimension into the planning, that's one thing that has really fundamentally changed and why it's so significant. The fact that these very large loads at a single site add a lot of operational complexity. So that's something I think that's important to understand. The batch process that we're moving towards is necessary because today, when a load comes, like you said, historically we've had, a transmission company would have 1, 2, or 3 large loads that they'd be working on over the course of a year. And today there's dozens of them and sometimes hundreds of them, depending on the company we're talking about. And what's happening is that our process effectively works closely with the transmission operator, and we do, these planning and stability studies to ensure that the grid and the transmission system can stably connect a large load into the grid and can serve it reliably across 8,760 hours. We analyze literally every hour of the year to make sure that that site can receive energy reliably and stably throughout an entire year's period. And so when we do these studies with a transmission company, we go back and forth over a period of time. It could be 6 to 12 months worth of work to do that. And then they would get a planning study approved. And that's kind of a stage in the interconnection process. The planning studies are approved. ERCOT is signed off on it. The transmission company is signed off on it. And effectively then what the customer does is then they build their site. And so then they build a site. It could take 1, 2, or 3 years to build a site. And then right before they come online, they go through one more check, and they go through a energy stabilization check, essentially. And so we just make sure that if nothing has changed, since the couple of years before when the planning studies were approved, now we have the as-built, so we know it's actually there. And so we do a last stabilization study and give them a green light to energize. That's the way the process has worked for the last 20 years. Well, imagine what's happening now with data center that gets in a planning study approved. They start constructing a site. They're building their site starting at, let's say 120 megawatts in the second year. And then they're ramping up to, let's say, 800 megawatts over the next 5 years. While they're doing that, 10 other projects within the same geography are doing the exact same thing. So the planning study that was approved for that company 2 years prior, all of a sudden the topology of the grid looks vastly different than it did when the study was approved. And we're sending them into this never-ending restudy loop where we have to go back and say, well, the planning study you just had approved has changed materially because the entire transmission system in your geography has changed based on all of these other projects that have come in. And so we recognized pretty quickly that this was the bottleneck we were heading towards, and the uncertainty that was creating for loads was really very, very destructive to the stability that you need for massive investment. And these data centers are huge investments. So the batch studies is intended to solve that issue. So what it does is and basically we're working towards what we call batch zero, which is to establish a baseline where all the projects that are getting ready to come online in the next few years are going to go through this batch study and establish essentially the requirements and demands on the transmission system in order to serve all of these loads. it will then create an allocation of transmission that'll be held for those projects. Because historically, we've never held transmission. Nobody in the US holds transmission for a project. You do a study and then you build and you assume the transmission capacity will be there when it's ready, but there's no holding of an allocation of transmission. Well, in this world, we have to do that because with Dispatch Zero, we're going to have a bunch of projects that'll get approved. The transmission will be allocated for them to build over the next 3 to 5 years. And then every year, we're going to have subsequently more data centers coming in, looking to interconnect and looking to grow, or manufacturers or other industrial customers or any large load. And so we have to do that with the knowledge of what's been committed historically so we don't derail those projects. Then we have to be able to support the new ones coming in and then define the transmission investments needed to serve all of them. So that's what the SCAC study is going to do, is effectively do all of them together on a cycle of, somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And then each year, rinse and repeat, come up with the study, evaluate what's available on the system, determine what needs to be built to serve, and then continue to remove that cycle of era.
That's just a follow up. Yeah, when I teach like electricity markets and electricity systems at UT, I used to skip over the part of like, oh, if there's too much generation and not enough load, like that never happens. That's not a big deal. That gigawatt data center tripped offline in PJM and like created havoc, right? And then you're right to bring that up. That is a new operational paradigm, right? It's like, it's not just like losing supply, it's like losing demand that quickly.
It has the same electrical effect. Yeah. And what's unique is that, the way large electronic loads often behave is that when they see a fault on the system, what they're designed to do is to protect the assets behind the meter, right? Because you've got super expensive GPUs and equipment behind the meter. And so they've got UPS systems that they can flip to instantly when they see something like that to protect those assets. And then a couple cycles later, reconnect to the grid. So we need to make sure that we understand when they're going to do that and what are going to be the performance requirements so that then we can plan around that. Because like you said, once we start to see a lot of these, gigawatt sized facilities spread throughout the state or clustered in areas on the site, that becomes a very unique risk.
I think the next logical question here, Pablo, is we're talking a lot about the transmission grid. And I think Josh and I have spoken about this at length on the podcast and how we have this really successful experiment in Texas that's called deregulation. And we're coming up as 25 years almost of deregulation in Texas that I think most of us would agree is a resounding success given all the generation that we've brought on. However, on the distribution grid, that's where I want to ask you a couple of questions because it feels like as a side effect of that experiment, we have utilities that are responsible for capital expenditure and we're telling them not to dip their toes in generation, right? They can't, the TDs in Texas are not allowed to generate. And what that means is, and I think you deserve a ton of credit for this because you've come out and spoken about the importance of demand response. You've spoken about the importance of DERs, behind the meter technologies, energy efficiency, all of this. And I think that's probably even more important now given all the load growth that's coming. So not feel so hard to crack given the regulatory structure we have in place. The fact that we know that substations will be overloaded in the future because of all the load growth that's coming. In your mind, is there a magic wand solution to this problem, or where do you see this going over the next few years as far as DERs, demand response, energy efficiency, all that?
You started the question with kind of the recognition of how important the competitive market has been to the success Texas has experienced economically. And it is because it's driven low cost energy that has helped the economic growth in this state for the last 20 plus years. And it's continuing to do that. So it's something that has been an incredible benefit, I think, to all Texans because of that construct. I believe that construct can be extrapolated deeper into the grid at the distribution level to leverage competitive forces on solutions and services that are now becoming more viable than they ever have in history. Those types of solutions and services are distributed resources that are going to be at premises, and that could be batteries at a home. It can be smart thermostats and smart pool pumps. It can be rooftop solar. It can be electric vehicles. All of these components that are behind the meter at a residence or at a commercial site can provide a functional resource service to the grid at large, especially when it's aggregated in total. And that's something that we've proven already with our ADER program, which is our Aggregated Distributed Energy Resource Program, that I think has been highly successful. We've just recently doubled the cap on that program, and we're looking to increase it even further because we're starting to really see momentum pick up on these types of resources proliferating throughout the Texas grid. And when you think about that, I mean, it's almost like the business model of an Uber or an Airbnb, where you've got distributed capital. So consumers and business owners are investing in energy resources to help them manage their reliability and manage their cost. And those same assets that are providing those benefits to the consumers can be double leveraged by the grid operator to provide services to the grid and provide another income stream or economic incentive for those same assets. So they're making the capital investment and putting rooftop solar on or buying an electric vehicle, but with the proper integration and aggregation, they can become a meaningful part of a supply or demand response mix. And that's really unique. And it's growing. We're seeing the evidence of it working. We actually have these aggregated resources inside of our energy only market providing energy. We also have them in our ancillary services. So if you think about that, those are our reserve services that we are really protective of because we lean on those in order to keep the grid reliable. Yet we've seen that the reliability and effectiveness of these aggregated resources can perform under the ancillary services requirements too, in ECRS and in the non-spin services. So it's really tremendous when you think about the potential. We're just getting started on that. And we're just starting to see companies that are in this space start to really take hold and grow. So I think we're in the very earliest innings of this trajectory. And I see a future where the grid operator is really moving out to the edge of the grid and working with consumers and the retailers and the aggregators and those that are interested in bringing that competitive creativity to this space and finding ways to actually be very economically successful with them.
We've talked about the, load growth changing. We've talked about, you talked about ancillary services. We've talked about how the supply mix has been changing. And then on top of that, we also recently changed a pretty big fundamental market design, like a little while ago, in terms of doing this real-time co-optimization plus batteries and kind of how we actually are, dispatching resources and how we're procuring those ancillary services we've talked about. Can you talk a little bit about what RTC+B, real-time co-optimization plus batteries, what that is, how that's a bit different, and well, frankly, how's it going? It's been going for a couple months now.
Yeah. We launched that, went live on December 5th of 2025, and it's been going really well. We saw during Winter Storm Fern the operational benefits of this that we hope to see, because what effectively we're now doing is, rather than taking the commitments for the ancillary services the day ahead and effectively holding them in those positions throughout the day in real time, what we're doing is in real time evaluating at every interval of the market whether it's more efficient from a cost perspective to hold one of the reserves and ancillary service with this resource or that resource. And we take the lowest cost resource, move it into the energy service space so that the dispatch comes down in its cost. And then the more expensive resources we could actually hold in the ancillary services in the case that, we need those. We're not losing anything in terms of the amount of ancillary service or reserves we have, but we're really optimizing the cost effectiveness of that. We are forecasting, to be able to save at the wholesale power market level more than $3 billion a year just by doing this type of a real-time optimization between what's serving energy and what's being held for reserves. We're seeing that financial trajectory realized. We're seeing it during the periods of more scarcity, which Winter Storm Fern a few weeks back gave us an opportunity to see that from an economic point of view. We also, so I mentioned the operational benefit. What it does is it will take a look at where the constraints on the system are, our dispatch system will, and it will move around between energy and ancillary services, what is providing energy in order to solve those constraints on the system. So it's going to have the opportunity to help bring down congestion costs in the system as well. And we saw that when we were seeing some constraints coming up into the San Antonio area on that weekend of Winter Storm Fern, there were some constraints on the transmission line feeding the San Antonio area from the valley. And we saw the RTC+B optimization activate some of the energy resources north of that constraint to alleviate that transmission congestion. So it's looking at, the most economic way to dispatch as well as the most reliable way to dispatch in order to manage the overall congestion of the system too. And so it's working extremely well. And then with the plus B, we built it from the bottoms up, thinking about the role that batteries play and optimizing how to dispatch batteries in order to, again, optimize the cost of serving energy and ancillaries. And batteries continue to be such a core part of that operational flexibility.
Kind of follow up with one question is there has been some, I guess, disagreement in some of the players around which of the ancillary services certain resources like duration limited storage, like duration limited resources like batteries can play. Could you just speak to ERCOT's stance on kind of how that's being implemented and kind of why y'all see it that way?
So if I understand your question, we have always wanted to try to understand what the battery operator is going to do because we don't control the dispatch. We don't control the state of charge for batteries. What we do is we set a set of requirements out for what the various ancillary services need to be able to perform and how we'll plan around them. So non-spin, you have to be able to come online in 30 minutes. You have to be able to run for 4 hours in order to serve that warrant. ECRS, we've got to be able to come online in 10 minutes. You have to be able to run for these different meal costs. And we've changed some of those definitions to actually shorten the requirements. So VCRS now is really a 1 hour product with the latest iteration. So what we were, talking about with batteries before was, well, if there's a 2 hour or 4 hour obligation, we need to make sure that you've got that in case you're called upon to provide that service. A lot of that has been resolved with the way RTC works. And so with real-time optimization, it knows what is available in the state of charge because it has to get updated and reported by those resources at every interval. And then it will make the decision based on what's in the tank on what to put into the next dispatch stack. And so I think we've become more flexible with the batteries and it's become less of a concern around some of these requirements. And frankly, we really like what we see in the batteries here in Texas. There's a lot of talk about, how do we get more duration? We would love to see more duration, but we don't want to lose the flexibility that we have.
Yeah.
A 1 hour battery that has 1 hour of let's say a 1 megawatt battery with 1 megawatt hour of energy, means that it can take its entire charge and give it to the grid inside of an hour. A 1 megawatt battery with 4 megawatt hours of energy means that it can provide that 1 megawatt hour over 4 hours, right? So that sounds good, and it is good. Having duration is good. But if you wanted to put those 4 megawatt hours on the grid in 1 hour, you can't do that. And so that's why the ERCOT market, with our very flexible rules, we've been tracking those shorter duration batteries because they have the most flexibility to perform when the grid needs them most. During those solar sunsets where we've got an hour and a half to 2 hours of really, peak need, the entire battery community can put all their energy on the grid at once. Whereas if they were, under the California model, they have to all have 4 hours of energy behind them, and they can't dump all that energy in a 1 or 2 hour period as needed. So you potentially are holding a bunch of economic energy behind a limitation on the inverter that can't put it all out of the system. So we really like the flexibility that we have with the batteries today. It's not saying we're not looking for more duration. Duration is always good. Right now, the name of the game is really flexibility. And the way we're structured gives us the flexibility.
We're coming up on time almost. And I wanted to make sure we asked you about residential demand response, Pablo, because it's working its way through different subcommittees. And again, I think your leadership on this issue has been really important. And when folks asked, like residential customers in Texas, why the industrials have access to demand response programs, but for the most part, residential folks don't, how do we solve that problem? And where is the challenge as far as just getting all the stakeholders on the same page and getting a new program out there that we can all support? And it's maybe the solution is a Texas solution, which is like, it might not be perfect, but let's fix it on the fly.
I couldn't agree more with you with that last statement that you just said. Every time we introduce something new, there's always the potential that it can be improved upon. And that should never prevent us from taking the step forward and learning through that experience. And I think that's right where we are right now at the precipice of considering some ways to do residential demand response, where let's start by, clarifying residential demand response is available broadly across ERCOT. There are many municipalities that have very successful programs, and competitive retailers are offering demand response incentives as well. But we believe that there's a lot more that we haven't tapped into yet, and that's where I think the opportunity lies. And so what we've been talking about is how can ERCOT step into that space, provide an economic incentive on top of what the competitive retailers and the municipalities are already doing in order to grow the share of residential demand response that's available to the grid. And that's the opportunity set. It's not about replacing or substituting what's already happening. It's about augmenting it to make it more valuable and to bring more people into the programs. And so the issues with moving this forward are the issues that happen with almost any change in our market. There's always very different stakeholder needs across the spectrum that are looking at, well, what's the impact going to be on wholesale prices? What's going to be the impact on potential economic revenues down the road? And so I think we have to think through balancing all those different interests. But in the short term, what I would say is we know we're going to be faced with challenges with this load growth that's coming our way. We know demand response is a relatively low cost and absolutely quicker timetable of a product that could be developed than building new supply, as an example of building new transmission. We spent a lot of time talking about building new supply and transmission, but we could create a demand response program in a matter of months and get it up and running and get the potential reliability benefit of it sooner. And that's the approach I think we should come into this looking at, saying, let's put a tool in the toolbox. Let's try it. Maybe it won't be perfect. Maybe it needs to be improved significantly after we start it. Let's put the tool in the toolbox and start learning from it. And then if we realize we need this and we need more of it and it needs to be better, then we can work on it and change it. But we're right at that junction now where you have to kind of get over that hump in order to move it forward. And it's really about a stakeholder policy discussion happening across the stakeholders in the state. And we need to get to that decision.
That's it. Before we get to like closing remarks, I kind of want to ask a little bit of a different question because you get folks like us on the panel and we're talking about energy and AI, where we're talking about, okay, how will that power these data centers? But I kind of want to talk about like, how can the electricity sector use AI to maybe do its operations better? I think the implementation of AI in big systems is a little bit of a mixed bag right now. We've seen Amazon having a come to Jesus moments with their engineers saying, you allowed AI to cause 13 hours of interruption. Now, if I don't get my phone case for an extra 13 hours, not a big deal from Amazon. But if I don't have power for 13 hours, that is a big deal. But then PJM has recently, another electricity market on the East Coast, has recently implemented more extensive dynamic line ratings. So they're able to change like the ratings of their transmission network given ambient conditions. Like if the wind's blowing and the lines are cooled down, you can move more power over them than you automatically would. And some of the underlying machine learning techniques and all those other kinds of things are similar across like these large language models, neural networks versus other types of models. So I'm just curious, to the extent you can, like how, or can speak about it, is ERCOT using AI? How can ERCOT use AI? Are you having talks about it? Like, what is it in the use of AI of electricity you're seeing?
Yeah, I think the really great irony of all of it is that the big challenge for talking about how to manage the growth of the power requirements, I think, can help get solved by the underlying technology that is driving those demands.
Yeah.
So in our world, we talk about AI through the lens of people-led AI. That's the first thing, is that this has to be people-led. We're not going to turn over the systems and the controls to machine learning or to AI, but we're going to keep it, inside of the central function where the people with experience are going to leverage it to help them do what they do better. We are looking at AI in a lot of different areas. So from the obvious, load forecasting. So using AI to take dozens of different weather forecasts and different load forecasts and be able to look at historical experience and then look at, the probabilistic changes in terms of weather and load and be able to run scenarios instantly, giving you a spectrum of likelihoods of what could occur over the next 5 minutes. We're starting to introduce AI into that process so that then as we experience what's going on in real time, the learning occurs and it improves, and we're constantly getting better with kind of the process of being able to do load and weather type forecasting to affect that part of our operations. In another area around queue management, there's a process of running studies, building cases, and running scenarios AI is very well suited to help facilitate and improve that, because we take data from lots of different sources to build these cases, and then we run them through these stability or dynamic models. And so AI can help with doing all of that data gathering, running these processes, analyzing the results, looking for anomalies, and giving the engineers, here are the places you should look at in terms of these stability results or these dynamic results. So we're starting to introduce AI into the core planning and modeling of what we're doing. So it's starting to come into so many different facets of our business, and it's going to continue to grow its capabilities. There were some releases of the AI large language models in the last 2 months that have had meaningful step forwards in the autonomous capabilities in terms of how long they can actually run without a human intervention.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see the benefits of that in, our coding, our development. Because if you look at ERCOT, we're a big tech company, right? We're running a tech platform. The biggest part of our workforce are technology engineers. So it's becoming a really important part of how we're thinking about real-time operations and planning. And we're going to continue to look to leverage that to get better on every level, reliability as well as cost effectiveness.
Well, I think we're pretty much at time, Pablo and Josh, and I just wanted to thank you so much again. We know you're busy, and the fact that you took a few minutes out of your day to speak with us really means a lot. Anything you wanted to add at the end? I'm feeling optimistic. I feel like this is a huge challenge that we have here as a state, but probably no state is better positioned than Texas to meet this.
I agree, Omen. I'd love to just get a quick perspective from either one of you. So you guys work inside of Texas, but you also have the opportunity to kind of look outside beyond our four walls. Are there things that you see outside of our four walls that you think are opportunities for us to learn from? Or are there things that, perhaps we should be looking to export more of in order to try to help this endeavor? Because a lot of what we do is oriented to Texans. We really are part of the national economy. We're a core part of it. And I think we should always be looking, broadly in terms of how we can help others in the industry make success.
I feel like I spend most of my time doing the opposite, getting called in from other places to talk about how we're doing things in Texas, to be honest with you. Just given how fast we're able to move and everything from our connect and manage approach and just this RTC+B, how fast we're able to move around. I'm going to kick it over to Matt, see if he has anything while I try to think on my feet really quickly.
Well, the one that comes to mind is there are states that do a really good job on DERs through TND deferral, which looks different in Texas because of the problem we were talking about earlier, right? Where we have our utilities responsible for just infrastructure, right? Just hard transmission and distribution infrastructure. And I think Josh and I agree, on the transmission side, we're doing pretty well because you've got really good price signals there on the transmission grid, but you don't have moves on the distribution grid because they're essentially regulated monopolies, right?
You have to stay on that space.
Exactly. So I think that's where we have some room for improvement. Like a study just came out showing, I think, almost $2,000 per ratepayer over the next 10 years if you're able to crack that TMD deferral piece. So I think that's what I'm looking towards moving forward here.
I guess the only thing is that I would say is we talked about congestion and we talked about, the price signals that we do see. Maybe the new large loads and everything and all the transmission that we're going to build will kind of alleviate this for a bit. I do think we could do a better job of leveraging the economic test for new transmission than we do. Because essentially, if we build a new transmission line, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, as I'm speaking to the CEO of ERCOT. If we build a new transmission line on the economic test, it essentially has to pay for itself in 1 year's worth of savings. And we mentioned earlier, transmission is a multi-decadal asset. And so anytime that I'm talking about everything that Texas does great, I usually am well, there's this one thing I really think we could do better. And that's what I would say is if there's any way the economic test for new transmission could be more, at least on the order of magnitude of the length of or the lifetime of the asset that it's paying back. I guess that would be my only feedback.
I think that's a really good point. And in fact, I'm glad you brought that up because it is something that we are working on right now. And there is another region. Other regions use this concept of an MVP, a multi-value kind of a proposition for evaluating the effectiveness of a transmission investment. And what you can do is you can take benefits across reliability, benefits across economics, and benefits across resiliency, and look at the three components and say, okay, well, you may not hit 100% on one or the other. The combination, the multi-value combined, creates enough of the hurdle overcomes the hurdle to pass the requirement to build that transmission. We should be looking at transmission to that same lens, because there is real value in resiliency, there's real value in economics, there's real value in reliability, and combining those metrics to come up with a combined value proposition for a project is a much more effective way than trying to just fully clear one hurdle or fully clear another hurdle.
Pablo Vegas, thank you for coming on the Energy Capital Podcast.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. If today's conversation helped you make sense of the energy world, share the episode with a friend and hit follow on your podcast app. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the usual platforms. For deeper analysis each week, subscribe to the Texas Energy Empowered newsletter at texasenergyempowered.com. That's where you'll find every episode, every article, and all of our latest updates. We're also on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube, where we post clips, insights, and ongoing commentary. Big thanks to Nate Peavy, our producer. I'm Matt Boms, and I'll see you next time. Stay curious, stay engaged, and let's keep building a stronger, smarter energy future.